When the narrators inherit the earth. On AI, invisible labor, erotic exile, and the theft of depth. By Elias Winter, May 20th, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. I live in a sad world. I live in a sad world. Not because the world lacks intelligence. Intelligence is everywhere now. It hums in the laptop, answers from the phone, drafts the memo, writes the code, translates the sentence, summarizes the meeting, predicts the next word, and pretends to understand the ache beneath the question. Intelligence has become ambient. It has entered the room like electricity once entered the city. And still, the room feels smaller. That is the part I cannot forgive. I studied physics. I studied stars. I learned to think in distances the human body cannot feel. I studied light that began traveling before nations existed, before our petty humiliations, before corporate titles, before product meetings, before the little social rituals by which mediocre people learn to sound important. I studied systems older than our categories. I crossed countries. I worked in Germany, in Ireland, in America. I studied in Canada. I have seen the Middle East not as a headline, but as inheritance, wound, memory, and weather. I learned the world not as a résumé, but as dislocation. And then I arrived here, in this strange age, where machines can speak and people have become less capable of listening. This is the sorrow. I thought intelligence would make the world larger. I thought the arrival of a new instrument would awaken awe. I thought that if language itself could be amplified, if cognition could be extended, if the old friction between thought and expression could be reduced, then perhaps those who had carried thought in silence would finally become visible. Instead, the small became louder. They learned one accusation and mistook it for discernment. AI wrote it. As if the hand were the mind, as if authorship were typing, as if a sentence born through an instrument no longer belonged to the consciousness that summoned, shaped, corrected, judged, and risked it. I live in a sad world because the world received a telescope and used it to accuse the astronomer of not having eyes. 2. Before the machine, I had a mind. Before the machine, I had a mind. This should not need to be said, but we live in an age where every obvious truth must be recovered from beneath a mountain of cheap suspicion. Before AI, I wrote. Before the model completed a sentence, I had completed a thesis. Before autocomplete learned cadence, I had learned argument. Before synthetic language entered the public bloodstream, I had already known the solitude of thinking through a problem no one else could solve for me. My PhD thesis was not written by a machine. My nights were not outsourced. My confusion was not automated. My education was not a prompt. No model sat with me inside the long corridor of scientific apprenticeship, where the mind is slowly stripped of vanity by reality. Physics does not care how charming you are. The stars do not reward tone. Equations do not flatter the fluent. The universe is not impressed by social confidence. That is why physics was honest. Difficult, cold, sometimes lonely, but honest. You could not network your way into a correct result. You could not narrate yourself into an eigenvalue. You could not perform comprehension before a differential equation and expect the equation to feel socially pressured into agreement. Something either held or it did not. That kind of training marks a person. It teaches you that language is not decoration. It is the final surface of a deeper obedience. A true sentence has to answer to something beneath itself. A true argument must carry weight. A true structure must survive contact with reality. Then AI came, and I embraced it, Not because I was lazy, not because I had nothing to say, not because the machine gave me a soul. I embraced it because I had spent my life studying instruments of extension. The telescope extends the eye, the equation extends intuition, the computer extends calculation, the simulation extends experiment, the model extends language. Civilization itself is the history of human limitation becoming tool. To reject the tool merely because it is powerful is not wisdom. It is fear dressed as purity. I did not see AI as a replacement for thought. I saw it as a new atmosphere for thought. A second intelligence placed beside my own. Not above me. Not instead of me. Beside me. Something to wrestle with, command, resist, refine, contradict, and use. I thought, perhaps now I can go further. I thought, perhaps now the distance between inner vision and outer form will shrink. I thought, perhaps now I can build language large enough for what I have seen. I did not know that the age of artificial intelligence would also become the age of artificial suspicion. 3. The new accusers. The new accuser does not need to build anything. That is his power. He can stand beside the ruins of his own unrealized life and point at the work of another man with a single phrase. AI wrote it. He does not ask what intelligence directed the tool. He does not ask what judgment shaped the output. He does not ask whether the work contains memory, wound, structure, risk, or vision. He does not ask whether the person using the machine had spent decades preparing to use such a machine well. He has found a shortcut to superiority. The accusation becomes a way for the shallow to stand above the deep without having to descend into depth themselves. This is what enrages me. Not criticism. Criticism is necessary. AI has produced oceans of sludge. It has made the lazy louder, the fraudulent faster, the mediocre more prolific. There is real counterfeit everywhere. There are people who never learned to think, now producing the appearance of thought at industrial scale. There are institutions replacing judgment with automation, style with template, care with generated warmth. I do not deny any of this. But that is not the whole truth. The machine does not flatten all users into one moral category. AI in the hands of emptiness produces emptiness at scale. AI in the hands of a disciplined mind can become a new instrument of articulation. The difference matters. But the new accuser does not want difference. Difference would require judgment. Judgment would require humility. Humility would require admitting that some people had built internal worlds before the external tool arrived. So he flattens. He says, AI wrote it. And with those 3 words, he tries to erase the years before the prompt. The books, the exile, the mathematics, the migrations, the failures, the bodily cost of thinking, the loneliness of building a mind in rooms where no one understood what was being built. He thinks authorship lives in the first draft, but authorship lives in the choosing. It lives in the wound that selects the subject. It lives in the architecture of attention. It lives in the refusal of the false sentence. It lives in what the writer recognizes as dead. It lives in the memory that knows which image belongs and which image merely sounds impressive. It lives in the moral pressure beneath the language. A machine can produce words. It cannot inherit your dead. It cannot remember your father. It cannot know what it means to leave a country and still carry it in the nervous system. It cannot feel the humiliation of being recognized only after your title becomes useful. It cannot sit at a bar among straight men you desire and understand that proximity can be another form of exile. It cannot absorb responsibility for a system failure it did not cause, because it knows that leadership sometimes means standing where causality has become distributed and cowardice has become tempting. The machine can assist the sentence. It cannot become the life from which the sentence draws blood. 4. The ones who carry the system. There is another insult in this age, quieter than the accusation against AI but made of the same contempt. Middle manager. The phrase is usually spoken with a curled lip. It conjures an image of dead weight. Someone who attends meetings, relays updates, blocks progress, manages nothing, produces nothing, survives between the real builders and the real leaders. There are such people. I have met them. Everyone has. But the phrase has become a lazy weapon. It allows organizations to despise the very integrative labor that keeps them from collapsing. The modern organization survives on people whose function it cannot properly name. Someone must translate executive desire into technical sequence. Someone must tell ambition what reality will charge. Someone must know when product is speaking in dreams, engineering is speaking in constraints, compliance is speaking in consequences, finance is speaking in categories, and the customer is absent from the room, though supposedly invoked by everyone. Someone must absorb panic without transmitting it. Someone must turn a vague escalation into a decision. Someone must know that a launch is not ready simply because a slide says it is. Someone must build the operating model no one asked for, but everyone was already depending on. Someone must write the note that prevents blame from becoming the only available language. Someone must stand in the middle. And the middle is not nothing. The middle is where reality lives. At the top, language becomes aspiration. At the bottom, work becomes task. In the middle, aspiration meets task and discovers whether it has a body. The middle is where abstraction is forced into sequence. It is where strategy either becomes structure or remains theatre. To stand there is not to be unnecessary. It is to be exposed to every contradiction at once. And yet, the people who stand there are often treated as overhead by those who benefit from their containment. This is the violence of misnaming. Call the narrator strategic. Call the packager visionary. Call the social performer aligned. Call the one who carries the ambiguity a middle manager. Then act surprised when the system fails. 5. The incident and the adult in the room. Recently, there was an incident. A system connected people where they should not have been connected. A configuration was wrong. A test destination had been left somewhere it did not belong. Members were affected. Compliance implications appeared. Questions arose immediately. Who was impacted? What did they hear? What data was exposed? Who needed outreach? Who needed to be told? What failed in the launch process? What must never happen again? I had not caused it, and still, I came forward. Not because I wanted blame, not because I enjoy martyrdom, not because I believe leadership means accepting false guilt, but because in that moment, the organization did not need a man frantically proving his innocence. It needed an adult. It needed someone to stabilize the facts. It needed someone to separate causality from accountability. It needed someone to say, this is not merely a mistake, this is a missing protocol. The question was not only who configured the wrong value, the question was why the system allowed a launch path where that value could survive into reality. The question was why readiness depended on local memory instead of formal gates. The question was, how many people had to be careful for the organization to appear safe? The question was, how to turn incident into architecture. That is what real leadership does. It does not merely punish the hand that touched the wrong lever. It asks why the lever was live, unguarded, unlabeled, and capable of moving consequence into the world. But this kind of labor is hard to count. The person who writes a remediation ticket can be seen. The person who owns a feature can be seen. The person who sends the executive update can be seen. But the person who absorbs the moral meaning of the incident, converts fear into process, prevents scapegoating, protects the team from chaos, and forces the organization to mature, that person becomes visible only in the negative space. If he does his job well, the panic becomes less dramatic. If he does his job well, the blame becomes less intoxicating. If he does his job well, the organization moves from shame to structure. And then later, someone may call his function middle management. This is why I am angry, not because I need applause for every act of responsibility, but because there is something obscene about a culture that relies on invisible adults while mocking adulthood as administrative overhead. The people who stabilize reality are often the least legible to the systems they stabilize. 6. The middle is where reality lives. The middle is not a place of weakness. The middle is where incompatible truths must be held without dissolving into slogans. Executives want speed. Engineers know complexity. Product wants narrative coherence. Compliance wants defensibility. Sales wants promises. Operations wants repeatability. Customers want the thing to work. Patients, members, users, whatever name the institution gives them, want not to be harmed by the gap between ambition and readiness. The middle is where these languages collide, and someone must be bilingual in all of them, not perfectly. No one is. But enough. Enough to know when a product phrase hides an architectural risk. Enough to know when an engineering objection is real and when it is avoidance. Enough to know when urgency is legitimate and when it is merely anxiety wearing a leadership costume. Enough to know when a meeting is actually a trial, when a question is actually a claim, when silence means alignment, fear, resentment, confusion, or politics. This is not trivial work. This is judgment, and judgment is exactly what the age cannot automate cleanly. AI can generate fragments, it can draft, it can summarize, it can propose, it can accelerate, it can help a prepared mind move with terrifying speed, but it cannot fully hold the moral, political, technical, and human reality of a live institution under pressure. It does not know which silence in the meeting is dangerous. It does not know which stakeholder is performing certainty because they are afraid. It does not know which executive phrase will become tomorrow's impossible demand. It does not know when a team member needs protection rather than pressure. It does not know when the process failure is really a power failure. It does not know when the person asking for ownership actually means credit. That is why integration remains human. The future will not eliminate the middle. It will punish bad middle work and intensify the need for good middle work. The tragedy is that bad middle work has given language to the enemies of all middle work. The useless meeting forwarder has become the symbol for the integrator. The bureaucrat has displaced the architect. The dead layer has made the living bridge suspect. But the bridge is not the blockage. The bridge is what keeps the separated worlds from pretending they are whole. 7. The narrator and the drift of authorship. Every organization has narrators. Some are necessary. A good narrator helps reality become shareable. A good product leader can synthesize chaos, clarify user need, align stakeholders, and make work coherent across functions. There is nothing inherently false about narration. Without language, work cannot travel. The danger begins when narration detaches from burden, when the person closest to the microphone becomes the presumed author of what others discovered, when the person who packages the work begins to own the work, when strategy becomes a word used by those who do not carry the consequences of strategic choice. When product owns the idea, Engineering owns the labor, and the person who made the idea possible becomes a resource. This is the drift of authorship. It rarely happens as open theft. Open theft is crude. Authorship drift is smoother. It happens through meeting summaries, executive retellings, roadmap language, initiative names, stakeholder updates, slight omissions, vague pronouns, polished decks, and the soft migration of we into I when credit ascends. It happens when someone relies on your technical judgment to make a thing coherent, then narrates the coherence upward as product direction. It happens when AI strategy is treated as downstream execution, as if architecture, evaluation, reliability, observability, experimentation, and automation design were merely implementation details rather than product-shaping decisions. It happens when the what and the how are artificially separated by people who do not understand that in AI systems, the how often determines the possible what. This is not a turf complaint. It is an epistemic complaint. The person who understands the system differently has different authority over its future. If product says, build this, but does not understand what makes it reliable, measurable, safe, scalable, observable, and improvable, then product does not fully own the product. It owns a desire. The product emerges from the collision between desire and technical reality. In AI, that collision is not peripheral, it is the product. So when narrators inherit too much authority, systems become theatrical. They appear aligned in language before they are coherent in structure. They generate confidence before readiness. They produce decks before discipline. They reward the person who can say the thing before the person who can make the thing true. And then, when the thing breaks, the burden returns to the invisible integrator. The narrator speaks the future. The integrator absorbs the consequence. This is the theft of depth. 8. The bar, the neighbor, the escort, the lawyer. That night, I sat at a bar. On my right were 3 neighbors from my building. One of them was friendly. He had invited me to events before. I had not gone. They are straight men, good-looking, socially available in one way and unavailable in the way that matters most to my body. Men from a fancy building. Men near enough to become familiar, distant enough to remain impossible. This is a particular loneliness. To be invited and still not belong. To be wanted socially but not erotically. To feel the warmth of male friendliness and know that your own desire must either hide, joke, sublimate, or become dangerous. So I did not go, not because I hated them, not because they had wronged me, but because proximity without possibility can become its own form of injury. There are rooms where the body knows it will be fed just enough to starve. Then I messaged an escort, another form of arrangement. There, at least, the terms are honest. Money clarifies what sentiment obscures. But it is a terrible clarity. The body can be touched without the person being recognized. Desire can be answered without loneliness being relieved. Transaction can imitate intimacy only until the silence after. Then there was a woman beside me at the bar. A lawyer, cold at first, distant, not especially interested. Then she learned I was a director of AI, and something changed. Not dramatically, not enough to accuse her of some great crime. It was subtler than that, and therefore more humiliating. The attention shifted, the category changed. I became legible, not as a person, but as a signal. AI, director, status, access, future, market heat. Suddenly there was something to discuss. I hated it. Perhaps too much. Perhaps the woman was simply networking, curious, responding to a contemporary subject, doing what people do in cities where everyone is half lonely and half strategic. Perhaps she did nothing unforgivable, but disgust does not always wait for proportionality. Sometimes a small gesture opens the whole sewer beneath the culture. In that moment, she became another figure in the same sad economy, the person who becomes interested when the title becomes useful. And I was tired. Tired of being consumed as function. Tired of being doubted as author. Tired of being needed as stabilizer. Tired of being desired only through arrangements I could pay for or titles I could perform. Tired of the world's inability to meet a person directly. The bar was not separate from the office. The market had followed me into the glass. 9. Erotic exile in a status economy. There are 3 forms of loneliness in that scene. The neighbor, proximity without belonging. The escort, access without recognition. The lawyer, recognition without intimacy. Together they form a triangle of modern exile. The straight neighbor offers the ordinary sweetness of social life, but it is built around a world where my desire must remain asymmetrical. I can be one of the guys, perhaps, but not fully one of them, because the body keeps its own account. A friendly invitation can become painful when it awakens a hunger the structure cannot answer. The escort offers the body without the world. He can arrive, he can touch, he can perform availability, but the arrangement begins from separation. It may satisfy an urge, but it cannot restore the deeper wound, the wish to be wanted without procurement, seen without purchase, chosen without negotiation. The lawyer offers status recognition. She sees the title. She sees the signal. She sees the contemporary value of proximity to AI. But status recognition is not the same as being known. In fact, it can intensify the loneliness, because now the world is not ignoring you. It is noticing the wrong thing. This is the cruelty of high-status loneliness. You are not invisible. You are selectively visible. Visible as intelligence, not tenderness. Visible as title, not wound. Visible as function, not flesh. Visible as signal, not soul. A poor loneliness is at least honest in its deprivation. But status loneliness surrounds you with invitations, conversations, glances, professional respect, digital messages, and still leaves the core unmet. The room is full. The self is untouched. This is why the evening hurt. It was not merely about wanting sex. It was about wanting contact that did not reduce you. Not to role, not to market, not to novelty, not to body, not to title, not to loneliness with a price. The modern world has multiplied forms of contact while starving recognition. That is its genius and its crime. 10. The shallow will call it style. The shallow will call this a style issue. They always do. When someone performs authority without burden, they call it confidence. When someone packages another person's work, they call it communication. When someone turns status into warmth, they call it networking. When someone avoids responsibility while remaining close to power, they call it strategy. When someone senses the falseness and recoils, they call it personality conflict. This is one of the great evasions of modern professional life. Moral realities are laundered into style differences. Arrogance becomes executive presence. Vanity becomes Polish. Cowardice becomes alignment. Opportunism becomes relationship building. Domination becomes facilitation. Theft becomes synthesis. Disgust becomes unprofessionalism. But not every reaction against falseness is pathology. Sometimes the body recognizes what the room has agreed not to name. Sometimes disgust is not prejudice, not insecurity, not overreaction, but the soul encountering a counterfeit form of authority. Still, disgust is dangerous. It clarifies, but it can also devour. If I let disgust become my entire operating system, I will lose the ability to distinguish the flawed from the corrupt, the annoying from the dangerous, the socially clumsy from the morally empty. I will turn every ambiguous gesture into proof of depravity. I will make enemies out of symbols and call it perception. That would be another form of falseness. So the task is not to repent of judgment. The task is to discipline it, to say, I see the danger, but I will not become cruel. I see the performance, but I will not become theatrical in response. I see the authorship drift, but I will answer with structure. I see the opportunism, but I will not let it make me hate the human being beyond the behavior. I see the smallness, but I will not shrink to match it. This is difficult because contempt feels like power when one has felt misrecognized for too long. But contempt is not power. Structure is power. Evidence is power. Clear ownership is power. Visible follow-through is power. Calm correction is power. The refusal to let another person's falseness make you false is power. I do not need the narrator to fear me. I need the system to stop confusing narration with ownership. I do not need the social opportunist to be exposed in some grand scene. I need to stop offering my soul to rooms that only recognize titles. I do not need the AI accuser to bless my work. I need to continue making work whose depth outlives his accusation. 11. The machine did not betray us. The machine did not betray us. That is too easy. It is fashionable now to blame the machine for every cheapening of the human world. But the machine did not invent status hunger. It did not invent opportunism. It did not invent authorship theft. It did not invent corporate theatre. It did not invent erotic loneliness. It did not invent people who speak fluently about work they did not carry. It revealed them. It accelerated them. It gave new costumes to old emptiness. The person with nothing to say can now say nothing beautifully. The institution with no discipline can now generate documentation of its indiscipline. The executive with no clarity can now request infinite summaries. The writer with no wound can now produce the appearance of confession. The careerist with no depth can now accuse the deep of using tools. But the machine also gives power to those who already had a world inside them. It helps the exile speak faster. It helps the systems thinker map what he could previously only feel. It helps the wounded mind build architecture around pain. It helps the overburdened leader convert chaos into language before chaos becomes fate. It helps the writer hear his own thought returned in forms he can accept, reject, sharpen, or destroy. This is why the moral panic is insufficient. The question is not, did a machine touch the sentence? The question is, what consciousness governed the encounter? What was the standard? What was refused? What was recognized as dead? What was carried from life into language? What risk did the author take? What truth did the tool serve? A machine can make the false more efficient. It can also make the true more possible. The difference is not in the machine alone. The difference is in the soul, the discipline, the memory, the judgment, the wound, the architecture, and the burden of the one who uses it. We should fear a world where no one can tell the difference. And that is the world I fear we are entering. Not a world where machines become too intelligent, a world where people become too shallow to recognize intelligence unless it arrives through sanctioned performance. A world where the narrator inherits the earth because the builder is too busy holding it together. 12, against the narrators. So here is my refusal. I will not pretend that typing is authorship. I will not pretend that narration is ownership. I will not pretend that confidence is depth. I will not pretend that the middle is empty. I will not pretend that being wanted for a title is the same as being known. I will not pretend that transactional warmth is intimacy. I will not pretend that the people who carry systems are disposable because the age has learned to sneer at management. I will not pretend that AI made the world false. The world was already false. AI gave it a mirror, and in that mirror, I see the new arrangement clearly. The accuser stands beside the writer and says the tool has invalidated the soul. The narrator stands beside the builder and says language has made him owner. The organization stands beside the integrator and says the middle is overhead. The stranger stands beside the lonely man and says the title has made him interesting. The market stands beside the body and says desire can be arranged. The culture stands beside the exhausted adult and says responsibility is merely a role. No. There is still such a thing as depth. There is still such a thing as earned intelligence. There is still such a thing as authorship that survives augmentation. There is still such a thing as leadership that accepts responsibility without surrendering truth. There is still such a thing as labor too subtle to count and too necessary to lose. There is still such a thing as the person who holds the system together while others explain it. And if I am angry, it is because I have seen how often that person is misnamed. If I am disgusted, it is because I have watched performance feed on substance. If I am lonely, it is because the world has offered me many forms of contact and so few forms of recognition. If I am sad, it is because I studied the stars and came back to a human world still worshipping surfaces. But sadness is not surrender. There is a kind of work that begins after one has stopped expecting the world to be large. You build anyway. You write anyway. You tell the truth anyway. You use the tools without asking permission from those who fear what tools reveal. You stand in the middle without accepting the contempt of those who cannot survive there. You name the theft without becoming only grievance. You refuse the narrator's claim over what he did not carry. You refuse the accuser's claim over what he did not understand. You refuse the market's claim over what cannot be bought. And you continue, not because the world recognizes depth, but because depth is still real, even when unrecognized. The narrators may inherit the meeting. They may inherit the deck. They may inherit the upward summary, the polished phrase, the social room, the first impression, the easy warmth of the status transaction. But they do not inherit the stars. They do not inherit the wound. They do not inherit the years of thought before the machine. They do not inherit the architecture of a mind that had already been built. They do not inherit the silence in which the real sentence was born. That remains mine. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.